glass towers catching the last rays of the sunset, the silent whispers of 8 million people passing each other daily. But stop looking at the traffic and flashing signs. You'll find layers upon layers of history silently tucked away beneath the pavement, waiting to be discovered. It was razed to the ground and rebuilt in stone. The city was almost completely emptied and then filled again with strangers from all over the world. It was conquered, bombed, flooded, and forgotten, and each time it found a way to rebuild itself. Tonight's history isn't just a list of kings and their histories. It's the story of a small piece of riverbank that has repeatedly refused to disappear for 2 millennia. We'll begin with a strange and surprising discovery beneath Trafalgar Square, a discovery that has nothing to do with kings or empires. And from there, we will trace London's slow and relentless expansion, street by street, fire by fire, century by century, through the centuries, until we reach its glittering skyline today. If you find peace in this tranquil journey through history, I ask that you like, subscribe, or leave a comment below. This helps others reach here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, all you need to do is settle into your place. Let your shoulders loosen from whatever is holding you. Let your breathing slow. Take your time, like the river finding its own rhythm, and as the noise of the day begins to subside, let's embark together on a journey into London's 2,000-year-old story of silent, tenacious survival. Let's begin together.
The London area hundreds of thousands of years later, leaving behind scattered stone tools and occasional bone fragments as their legacy. But for a very long time, there were no inhabitants, no names, no walls, no streets, no signposts, just a river valley used and traversed, never claimed. There is another passage in the story that rarely makes it into history books. Long before Britain became an island, it was the western edge of continental Europe, connected by a vast, low-lying, marshy area that archaeologists now call Doggerland. People and animals once roamed freely across this land. With the end of the Ice Age and rising sea levels about 6,000 years ago, the rising waters of the North Sea completely separated Britain from the mainland. The River Thames, which would one day define London, had been patiently shaping the ground where a city would eventually rise for tens of thousands of years.
Where London's history as a city truly began. The Romans had recently conquered Britain and needed a strategic, defensible base on the river, from which a fleet could land and supplies could be transported inland. They chose an area on the banks of the Thames and named it Londinium. It was a small place, surprisingly small by modern standards. It covered an area roughly the size of present-day Hyde Park. A determined walker could traverse the entire city from end to end in about half an hour. Londinium was located on the north bank of the Thames, where the city of London stands today, the same place where St. Paul's Cathedral now stands. The Romans chose this spot for a simple and practical reason. It was situated at a low and accessible point on the river, easily reachable by both land and sea. In other words, it was the perfect location for a port. The plan worked. Londinium quickly became an important trading center, and its population grew at a rate that surprised even the Romans who built it. This was no simple military outpost clinging to the border of an empire. It was a city deliberately built in precisely the right place at precisely the right time, and within a few years it had grown into something far greater than anyone had initially intended. Londinium's early years were not as peaceful as its founders had hoped. Around 60 or 61 AD, less than 20 years after the city's founding, a Roman ally turned into a devastating enemy. Boudica, queen of the Iceni tribe in eastern Britain, had reached her limits of endurance in the face of Roman tyranny and plunder after the death of her husband. She raised an army and marched on settlements in Roman Britain, leaving destruction in her wake. Londinium, still young and mostly made of wood, lay right in Boudica's path. The Roman governor made a ruthless calculation. The city was indefensible in time, and abandoning it to its fate, she evacuated those who could escape and left the rest behind. Boudica's forces razed Londinium to the ground. Archaeologists have found a thick layer of red ash and burnt debris beneath the modern city, a single physical scar from that catastrophic day, still visible to anyone who knows where to dig. For a city still in its infancy, this was a surprising setback. Yet it was one of London's earliest lessons, a lesson it would learn and repeat over the next 2 millennia. A city built in the right place for the right reasons doesn't remain buried for long. Londinium rose from its ashes, rebuilt, and within a generation became larger and safer than ever before.
The threats facing medieval London were not limited to fire, hygiene problems, and disorder. Famine and plague struck repeatedly. The of Islamic plague, known as the Black Death, which arrived in 1848. Over a century and a half for the city to retrieve its former population. Yet, as always, it was recovered those discovered. By 1405, the period began. London had entered a true age of prosperity. Trading companies were established through this opportunity, not only the people, but also the right of the man. Yeah, verily, the city marked the water flat and wealthy, and despite pretty outbreaks in the spring period, the population continued to grow from approximately 50,000 at the beginning of the period to 200,000 by the end. With heavily being settled.
The city that rose from Boudica's ashes grew faster and stronger than the one she destroyed. By the 2nd century, Londinium was home to up to 60,000 people, a remarkable number for a city that didn't exist 200 years earlier. The city was growing not only in size, but also in grandeur. The city's basilica, housing the courts of law and other civic institutions, was one of the largest buildings north of the Alps at the time. Around the 200th century, construction began on something even more ambitious. A defensive wall that would eventually stretch for over 2 miles and encircle the entire city. Sections of this wall, repaired and patched over the centuries, still stand today, most notably near the Tower Hill subway station. However, growth in Londinium was never simple or uninterrupted. In the second half of the 2nd century, a great fire ravaged much of the city again, and it may have been accompanied by a plague epidemic. The population dwindled. This has become a recurring pattern throughout London's history. Expansion, followed by disaster, then a long and patient period of reconstruction. Londinium never fully regained its former glory under Roman rule, but though its population dwindled, it refused to completely disappear, remaining the capital of Roman Britain. Some of the city's quieter corners have only recently come back to light. Beneath the modern offices of today's financial district, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a Mithras temple dedicated to Mithras, a mysterious Eastern god particularly popular among distant Roman soldiers and merchants. Not far away, the remains of a Roman amphitheater, large enough to accommodate several thousand spectators for public performances, were only discovered in the 20th century, buried beneath London's modern town halls. An entire Roman city, with its temples, theaters, and forums, continues to wait quietly in the soil beneath London's banks and offices.
at Runnymede, and among its many clauses was a short but significant promise. The City of London would enjoy all its former freedoms and free traditions on land and water. It was a small line within a much longer document, but it captured something fundamental about the city's place in English life. Kings came and went, dynasties rose and fell, but London had already quietly and persistently begun to insist on largely self-governance. Much of the growth of the period stemmed from immigration. Merchants and businessmen from France, Denmark and Germany arrived, drawn by the allure of opportunity. Alongside them was a large Jewish community that made significant contributions to the city's commercial life. However, London's relationship with the newcomers was never simple. Tensions and violence against the Jewish community steadily increased, and by the end of the 13th century, London's Jewish population was forced to leave the country altogether. Even the most cosmopolitan cities, it turns out, always carry a darker undercurrent alongside their diversity, and London was no exception then, nor in the centuries to come. Growing population demanded space, and legal regulations could only slow London's outward expansion for a time. Throughout the 16th century, the city expanded westward to St. Giles and eastward to places like Spitalfields and Whitechapel, which would eventually become the East End. Hedges gave way to streets, streets to small houses, tanneries and breweries. While the East End housed many of London's poorest residents, those with money found space and comfort in magnificent mansions built outside the city in what was then open countryside, such as Lambeth and Fulham. One of the most opulent examples was Hampton Court Palace, built 12 miles from the city centre and for a time the favourite residence of King Henry VIII. The king needed the space not only for his massive palace, but also for tennis courts, bowling alleys, and a private hunting park. In the final year of the same century, a group of London merchants formed the East India Company, receiving a royal privilege to trade with Asia. Beginning as a humble trading venture, this company grew over the next 2 centuries into one of the most powerful and influential commercial enterprises the world had ever seen, eventually controlling vast territories in the Indian subcontinent and reshaping global commerce from a series of offices in the City of London. But even the more affluent corners of Tudor London were, by modern standards, filthy and chaotic. Those who could afford to leave often did so. What kept everyone there, despite the grime, was something London had begun to offer in abundance: entertainment. Jutons and tournaments, ice skating on the frozen Thames, the cruder pleasures of Southwark's brothels, and a far more violent version of football than the one played today. Pubs were packed with live music, and a true cultural scene was beginning to flourish as itinerant theatre troupes performed wherever they could find an audience. The 18th century brought rapid growth in every area: population, geography, and economy. London began the century with approximately 630,000 inhabitants and finished it with around 1 million, thanks to declining infant mortality rates, increased fertility, and a constant influx of immigrants. French Protestants arrived in significant numbers, while there were also growing Irish and Jewish communities and an expanding black community. Some working in domestic service, others were former slaves arriving in London via the Caribbean or North America, and included veterans who had fought for the British during the American Revolution. Much of the century's intellectual and commercial energy was channeled not in courts, but in the coffee houses that sprang up rapidly throughout the city during this period. These were noisy, smoky rooms where merchants, writers, and politicians gathered to read newspapers, debate, and strike deals over endless cups of coffee. One coffee house, particularly near the Thames, run by a man named Edward Lloyd, became a preferred meeting place for ship owners and merchants to insure their cargo against the risk of loss at sea. From these informal meetings, Lloyd's of London was born, which today is one of the world's leading insurance markets and a direct heir to 18th century coffee and conversation. 1960s and reaching 6.5 million by the end of the century. This growing self-confidence was most strikingly displayed at the Great Exhibition, which opened in Hyde Park in the summer of 1851. Inside the enormous glass and iron structure known as the Crystal Palace, visitors from Britain and the world marvelled at the machinery, art, and manufactured goods from every corner of the British Empire and beyond. In just a few months, over 6 million people passed through its gates, each returning home with the feeling that London was truly at the heart of the modern world. While much of the century's growth was driven by natural population increase and internal migration, immigrants, particularly those following the devastating famine in Ireland and refugees from France, Italy, Germany and Spain, also played a significant role. London's Jewish population continued to grow, joined by smaller but significant communities from India, China, and Africa. By the middle of the century, almost 40% of Londoners had been born outside the capital, and surprisingly, that proportion has remained almost the same today. And so we come to the end of our London journey tonight. We followed a silent river crossing stretching from a half-square mile Roman outpost to a vast capital city inhabited by nearly 9 million people. We watched it burn, drain, flood, and rebuild time and again throughout plague, fire, war, and centuries of patient expansion. We met Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Tudors, Victorians, and a long procession of people from every corner of the world who, by opportunity, desperation, or simply by chance, chose this strange, misty riverbank as their home. This was never just a story of kings and conquerors. This was the story of a city learning how to start anew, again and again. And now, as that long story recedes, let its noise fade. Let the light stretching along the Thames turn into a silent glow. Let the bridges fall silent, the traffic descend into a distant stillness, and the ancient stone walls, now hidden beneath glass and concrete, sink back into silence. There is nothing else to follow tonight. Rest your shoulders, breathe slowly, comfortably, and without haste. Let each thought flow by like a barge slowly making its way down a dark river, not hurrying to get anywhere. If you enjoyed this journey, you are invited to like, subscribe, or leave a comment below. This helps others reach here, one sleepy soul at a time. And if you are still awake, there must be another journey through history waiting for you on the screen. But for now, let's leave the past behind. Let the ancient stones of the city fall silent and let your mind be free from the effects of the day. Sleep well and good night.